Christmas Eve in Tenerife. On December 24th, 2009, Alexis Martinez was exactly where he wanted to be. He was 29 years old, a Spanish national, and one of the orca trainers at Loro Parque, a large marine park on the island of Tenerife. The park's orca program had been set up in partnership with SeaWorld, and the animals in its care had been transferred from SeaWorld facilities in the United States. Martinez had been working with them for years. He knew the routines, the hand signals, the individual personalities of each animal. Colleagues described him as calm, technically precise, and fully committed to the work. It was Christmas Eve, and the park was running a morning rehearsal before the afternoon public show. The orca he was working with that day was named Quito. Quito had been born in captivity at SeaWorld Orlando in 2002. He had never lived in the ocean. He had been raised inside tanks, trained from an early age on a system of positive reinforcement, and described by multiple staff members as cooperative and socially engaged. There was no documented escalation in the days before the incident. No behavioral warning on file. Nothing in the training logs that morning suggested what was about to happen. During the rehearsal, Quito struck Martinez with significant force, drove him to the bottom of the pool, and held him there. The other trainers responded immediately. By the time they reached him, Martinez was unresponsive. Emergency services were called. He was pronounced dead a short time later. The autopsy found blunt force trauma and severe internal injuries. His liver had been ruptured. His sternum was fractured. The force required to produce those injuries is consistent with the full weight and speed of an adult orca moving at velocity. In the aftermath, Loro Parque and SeaWorld publicly disagreed about trainer qualifications, safety protocols, and who bore responsibility for the incident. Those disputes continued in court for years. Quito was not moved. He continued to live at Loro Parque. As of the time of writing, he is still there. The last dive. Philip Chan was 62 years old in the autumn of 2016. He had worked at Underwater World Singapore since the day it opened in 1991, 25 years without interruption. He was the facility's head diver and one of its most recognizable figures. He knew every tank, every current, every animal in the building. Staff and visitors alike described him as someone who genuinely loved the work in a way that was visible from the outside. During the Christmas season, he had a long-standing tradition of dressing in a Santa Claus costume and hand-feeding the sharks and stingrays while visitors pressed against the glass. Underwater World Singapore had shut its doors to the public in June of 2016. Years of financial difficulty and increasing competition from newer, larger facilities had made the operation unsustainable. The aquarium was permanently closed. Around a dozen employees were kept on after closing, tasked with caring for the remaining animals and coordinating their transfer to new homes. Chan was one of them. He had the option to leave. He stayed because the animals were still there and someone with experience had to look after them. On October 5th, 2016, Chan entered the water to assist with the transfer of a stingray. At some point during the process, the animal drove its tail barb directly into his chest. Stingrays are not aggressive in the predatory sense. The barb is a last resort, a defensive mechanism that deploys in response to sudden movement, pressure, or perceived threat. When it strikes, it enters tissue like a serrated spike. In several species, it also delivers venom. The injury it produces depends entirely on placement. A strike to the chest near the heart carries a high probability of being fatal. The Australian wildlife presenter Steve Irwin had died in almost identical circumstances a decade earlier, in 2006. A barb to the chest during an open water dive on the Great Barrier Reef. His death had been widely covered and had briefly brought international attention to how dangerous stingray encounters could be, even for professionals with decades of experience. Chan was pulled from the water and transported to a hospital. He died that afternoon. Singapore police opened an investigation and classified the incident as an unnatural death. The Haw Par Corporation, which owned the aquarium, suspended all further animal transfers and issued a statement calling it a tragic accident. No further detail was provided publicly. It was the first recorded death of this kind in Singapore's history. The Sealand incident. Sealand of the Pacific was a small marine attraction located near Victoria, British Columbia, built on a floating platform anchored in the harbor. It housed 3 orcas, Tilikum, who had been captured off the coast of Iceland in 1983 at approximately 2 years old, and 2 dominant females named Haida II and Nootka IV. The hierarchy inside the tank was rigid and enforced through physical contact. The females were dominant. Tilikum was the youngest and lowest-ranked animal, and the relationship between them was frequently hostile. Staff had documented that Tilikum was regularly raked, scratched with teeth along the skin by the 2 females. The tank was small by any standard. There was no separation available. There was nowhere for him to go. At night, all 3 animals were moved into a module approximately 20 feet in diameter and kept there until morning. Keltie Byrne was 20 years old. She was a marine biology student at the University of Victoria. working part-time at Sealand as a trainer. On February 20th, 1991, during a live performance with an audience in attendance, she slipped on the wet edge of the pool and fell into the water. What happened over the following minutes was witnessed by audience members still seated in the stands. All three orcas moved toward her. She was pulled under. She surfaced once, audibly screaming. She was pulled back down. Trainers threw life rings and long poles into the water. The animals pushed the equipment away from her and away from the edge. There was no way to reach her. There was no protocol in place for a scenario like this. Her body was recovered later that night, after the orcas had been guided into a secondary holding area. Keltie Byrne was the first person ever confirmed killed by an orca in captivity. Tilikum had been directly involved. Within the year, Sealand of the Pacific permanently closed, citing financial difficulties. Tilikum was sold to SeaWorld Orlando. SeaWorld was made aware of his history, including the circumstances of Byrne's death, before the transfer was finalized. After hours at SeaWorld, 8 years later, on the morning of July 6, 1999, a SeaWorld Orlando employee arrived at the orca enclosure to begin the morning routine. Tilikum was in the water. So was a man. The man was lying face down across Tilikum's back, unmoving. He was naked. His clothing had been folded and left on a railing near the edge of the pool. His name was Daniel Dukes. He was 27 years old, originally from South Carolina. He had no documented connection to SeaWorld, its staff, or its operations. Investigators concluded that he had most likely entered the park during regular operating hours as a paying visitor, concealed himself somewhere on the grounds after closing time, and at some point during the night made his way to the orca enclosure and entered the water. How exactly he got past the barriers was never conclusively determined. Precisely what happened once he was in the water was also never established. No security cameras covered the relevant area at the time. No witnesses came forward. No one who worked at the park that night reported seeing anything unusual. The medical examiner listed the official cause of death as drowning. The report also noted multiple lacerations and contusions across the body, consistent with contact with a large marine animal. Hypothermia was listed as a contributing factor. The temperature had dropped considerably overnight. The water in the tank was cold. Whether Dukes entered the water alive and drowned, or was already incapacitated when he entered, could not be determined from the physical evidence. SeaWorld issued a brief public statement, described the incident as a tragic trespassing accident, and reopened the park the following day. Tilikum remained in service. Dine with Shamu. 11 years passed. Tilikum performed in shows. He fathered calves through SeaWorld's breeding program, and his genetics are represented in a significant portion of all orcas currently living in captivity, anywhere in the world. He continued to be one of the most visible and commercially significant animals at SeaWorld Orlando. On February 24, 2010, Dawn Brancheau was working at the Shamu Stadium. She was 40 years old and had been employed at SeaWorld for more than 15 years. By the assessment of her colleagues, her supervisors, and the company's own internal records, she was one of the most experienced orca trainers in the world. She had specifically been cleared to work with Tilikum under a restricted protocol that had been developed following the deaths of Byrne and Dukes. The protocol was explicit. No in-water contact with Tilikum under any circumstances. All interaction was to occur from the pool's edge or from the shallow water platform. Trainers were never to enter the tank. The show that morning was called Dine with Shamu, a format in which park guests ate lunch at tables beside the main pool while trainers conducted sessions with the orcas at close range. Brancheau had just finished working with Tilikum and was lying on the trainer's platform at the water's edge, facing downward, continuing to interact with him from the surface. Then he took her. Witness accounts differ slightly on the initial point of contact. Some reported that he grabbed her arm. Others described him taking hold of her hair, which she wore that day in a long braid or ponytail. What followed is not in dispute. Tilikum pulled Brancheau into the water. He held her under. He shook her repeatedly with force. He did not release her. Trainers immediately initiated every available redirect measure. Acoustic recall signals, food withdrawal, physical barriers. None of it worked. The session continued for an extended period before her body could be recovered. Dawn Brancheau died from blunt force trauma and drowning. The autopsy documented fractures across multiple bones. She was the most experienced trainer at the facility and had been working under the specific protocol designed in direct response to Tilikum's prior incidents. Following her death, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration cited SeaWorld for willful safety violations and issued a ruling that trainers could no longer work in close physical proximity to orcas during performances. SeaWorld contested the ruling in court for years before ultimately complying. Tilikum was removed from the main performance pool and placed in a medical enclosure. He was not retired. SeaWorld continued to use him for breeding purposes and returned him to limited public-facing areas of the park during the years that followed. Tilikum died on January 6, 2017, from a bacterial lung infection. He had been in captivity for 33 years, 12 years in Miami. Hugo was captured off the coast of Iceland in 1968. He was approximately 3 years old at the time of capture. He was transported to Miami Aquarium in Florida, where he spent the rest of his life. For several years, Hugo performed alongside another orca named Lolita, who had been captured separately and brought to the same facility. The two were housed together and performed in the same shows. In 1980, Lolita was moved to a separate tank. Hugo was left alone. His tank at Miami Aquarium was small. It measured roughly 20 meters in length. For an animal that, in the wild, travels up to 160 kilometers per day, the dimensions of the enclosure left almost no room for meaningful movement. Hugo began exhibiting what animal behaviorists classify as stereotypic behavior: repetitive, purposeless actions that appear in captive animals under conditions of chronic stress or insufficient stimulation. In Hugo's case, the behavior was physical. He began ramming his head against the walls and the metal gates of his tank, not occasionally, repeatedly, over an extended period. Staff at Miami Aquarium documented the behavior. It continued. The impacts were forceful enough to be audible outside the tank. Hugo sustained visible injuries to his rostrum, the front portion of his head, over the course of the behavior. Despite this, no change was made to his housing or his situation. On March 4, 1980, Hugo died. He was approximately 15 years old. The cause of death was a brain aneurysm. It was directly attributed to the repeated blunt force trauma he had inflicted on himself against the walls of his enclosure. He had been in captivity for 12 years. If you liked this video, hit subscribe for more like it, and let me know in the comments what you want to see next.